Bram Cole had written in a letter that he had prepared 2 chairs on his porch, waiting for the woman brave enough to enter his life. But on that winter day in 1885, when Sarah Lane arrived in the Dakota Territory with her small wooden trunk, what greeted her was not a home, but a notice of land confiscation, cruelly nailed to the oak gate. The man who had promised her shelter stood in the yard, his hands bleeding from the barbed wire that had just been cut by his enemies. Sarah had traveled thousands of miles to escape the contempt of the city, yearning for a place to belong. But ironically, the tall, weathered man standing before her now stood on the brink of losing everything. The prairie wind howled, tossing the second chair over on the empty wooden porch. Sarah tightened her grip on the trunk handle, looked directly into the eyes of the stranger she was about to call husband, and said in a cold voice, "You wrote that the second seat would be waiting for me, but you forgot to tell me that this entire porch is about to be stolen." Bram had no idea that the small woman who had just stepped out of the carriage wouldn't choose to turn and run. She hid a tool at the bottom of her trunk, a secret about metal letters, the only weapon that could turn the tide of life and death in Hollow Bend, or bury them both forever beneath the approaching blizzard. 3 years earlier, Bram Cole had arrived in the barren land at the bend of Hollow Bend Valley with a 160-acre land certificate, a herd of sickly cattle, and a haunting ghost in his mind. That ghost was his honest but illiterate father, who had lost his entire fortune by signing a dubious promissory note he didn't understand. The wound from the deception of the written word had turned Bram into a sullen man, one who would rather bear the burden himself until his back ached than ask anyone for help. He had meticulously sawed each pine log and carried each cobblestone to build this roof with an unusual stubbornness. The day he painstakingly built 2 chairs for the porch, which wasn't even finished roofing, his neighbor, Will Moss, laughed. "You're not even married yet, Bram." Bram simply wiped away his sweat, hammered in the last nail, and replied, "Not yet, but I know I'm not building this place just for one person." That's why his fiancée advertisement in the St. Paul newspaper didn't promise a life of silks or an easy life. He wrote only about the harsh realities of the frontier, an oak cabin, an empty second chair, and a winter road that people had to shed blood to hold onto if they wanted to survive. Among the dozens of replies overflowing with sentimental, fragile words, only one envelope, reeking of ink, made Bram stop. Sarah Lane didn't write romantic words. She frankly admitted she was a typesetter, familiar with numbers, not good at feigning gentleness, and absolutely unwilling to enter a marriage to be a silent shadow. Reading those sharp words under the flickering storm lamp, Bram realized for the first time a fateful truth. The woman sitting in the second chair on the porch wasn't someone who needed his protection. She was the only one brave enough to face the storm with him. Returning to the harsh reality, Sarah pushed open the door and stepped into the oak house she knew by heart through her writings. The cobblestone fireplace blazed brightly, but the atmosphere between the 2 men who had just come face to face was colder and thicker than the howling wind in the meadow. In a deep, resigned voice, Bram began to speak of the bitter truth behind the note pinned to the door. Victor Shaw, the grocery store owner and the debt collector who had strangled the entire town, had filed a complaint with the land office to seize the land outright. He had used the excuse that Bram had been away for several weeks helping neighbors herd cattle across the valley, falsely accusing him of abandoning the land and violating residency laws. "Why didn't you mention a word in the letters?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixed on the man standing with his back to her. Bram avoided her gaze, replying with suppressed anger. "Because I don't want you to throw away a peaceful life to go to a place where you could lose everything tomorrow." Anger flared in Sarah's eyes. "I didn't travel thousands of miles to be treated like fragile porcelain, Bram." She stood up abruptly, resolutely demanding to see all the legal documents, from the land reclamation receipts and the nail purchase ledger to the tax receipts. Bram froze, his hand clenching into a fist. The haunting memory of those shady papers that had taken his father's life filled him with disgust and a desire to avoid words. But under the unyielding gaze of this woman, he reluctantly pulled the old chest from under the bed, revealing his utter helplessness. Sarah glanced over the crumpled bills, then paused for a long time at the dispute notice that had just been taken down from the door. The ink-stained fingers of a skilled typesetter gently traced the rough surface of the paper. She squinted at the ink indentation, observing the unusual spacing between the lines, then looked up at Bram and uttered a sentence that made his heart skip a beat. "Bram, this notice, the ink indentation is uneven. This is absolutely not the kind of paper printed by a decent law office." The next morning, under a still gloomy gray sky, Bram took Sarah for a horse ride to see the trail called Hollow Bend Trail. It was a narrow, winding path at the bottom of a low valley, sheltered by towering cliffs, where the fury of the Dakota snowstorm was halted before it could tear everything apart. In this remote frontier, when winter descends and locks down the tall pastures, that trail is the only lifeline for small farms to herd their livestock down to the lowlands for refuge. "Victor Shaw isn't after my 160 acres of barren land," Bram said bitterly, his breath freezing in the air. "What he really wants is to take this trail. If Coal Bend Ranch fell to Victor, he would erect a gate to block the way, suffocating all supply lines, forcing desperate farmers to sell their livestock cheaply or become perpetual debt slaves to his shop." But before he could finish, Bram's eyes darkened as he noticed a section of the barbed wire fence to the south had been severed with pliers. Some of his cattle had spilled over into the neighboring area, a perfect prearranged excuse for the merchant to accuse Bram of mismanaging the land and harming his neighbors. Without hesitation, Bram spurred his horse down the slope, frantically herding the panicked livestock amidst the swirling dust and biting wind. He was certain the city woman would cower in the carriage, covering her face in fear. But he was wrong. Sarah leaped to the ground, decisively tearing off her red scarf, ripping it in half and tying it tightly to broken wooden stakes to mark the patching areas. Immediately afterward, she pulled out her notebook, ran along the edge of the fence, and calmly helped him count each of the restless livestock. Amidst the mud and sweat, they didn't exchange any empty romantic words. But her recklessness proved Sarah wasn't just a sharp mind with papers. She was truly a companion willing to get her hands dirty. When the last cow was herded into the fence, Sarah smoothed her sweat-soaked hair, her eyes scanning the count lines in her notebook, her voice suddenly sharp as a knife. 3 cows short, Bram, and look at these crushed hoof prints. They lead straight to town, right toward Victor Shaw's warehouse. Victor Shaw's department store in town smelled strongly of roasted coffee, saltpeter, and leather. But beneath that facade of prosperity lay a massive debt trap strangling the entire community. Victor stepped out to greet them in an expensive wool coat, wearing a deadly polite smile, a smile that never reached his eyes. When Bram angrily questioned him about the 3 missing cows bearing the iron marks of Coal Bend Ranch, Victor neither denied nor admitted it. He leisurely tapped his gold-ringed fingers on the thick ledger. subtly reminding Bram of the barbed wire debt from the spring. And of course, the land dispute complaint hanging over his head. "If you know what's good for you," Victor lowered his voice, a sinister glint in his eyes, "I'll buy that land back for a price that will allow you and your new bride to leave Dakota with dignity before you lose everything." While Bram gritted his teeth, suppressing the raging anger, Sarah feigned indifference, slowly walking along the counter to observe. But the eyes of a former bookkeeper quickly scanned Victor's ledger, half open on the table. The numbers were meticulously recorded, but clearly showed signs of sophisticated tampering to inflate interest rates. Using the excuse of buying a pack of writing paper, Sarah ventured into a secluded corner of the shop, where a small manual printing press was half covered by a tarp. With ingrained professional reflexes, she quickly glanced at the jumbled tray of metal type. She immediately noticed the lead type was severely worn after years of illegal stamping. The R, in particular, had a chipped bottom corner, and the B had a crack in its middle. Victor, noticing her sharp, piercing gaze, lost his smile. He vaguely realized that this petite Eastern woman was not an easy target to intimidate. That evening, on the bumpy, horse-drawn carriage ride back to the farm under the flickering storm lamp, Sarah flattened the notice of dispute on her lap. Pointing to the unevenly smudged ink, she looked up at Bram and whispered a truth that would change everything. "Look, Bram. The B in your name and the R in ranch. This chip, it's exactly like the typewriter tray in the dark corner of Victor's shop." The carriage stopped before Will Moss's dilapidated wooden house, where the occasional hacking cough of a frail woman echoed through the gaping wooden walls, despite the howling wind. Will, once a warm neighbor who had helped Bram build his house, now facing his old friend, the poor farmer lowered his head, desperately avoiding eye contact. After a suffocating silence, the sordid truth was finally brought to light. Will bitterly confessed to having signed a fraudulent statement for Victor Shaw. That statement falsely claimed that Bram had abandoned the land for weeks, and the price for that betrayal, tragically, was only a few doses of medicine to save his wife, who was groaning with fever. Rage surged through Bram. The image of his unfortunate father, deceived by the paperwork and losing his life, flashed before his eyes, tearing through his composure. "You betrayed me with a piece of paper. You didn't even know what it said, Will." Just as Bram was about to lunge forward in a fit of rage, Sarah stepped up, placing her small but firm hand on his arm, which was trembling with anger. She turned to Will, casting aside personal feelings, to question him in a sharp voice. "Will, think carefully. That paper, did Victor read it to you, or was it pre-printed with just a blank space?" It was pre-printed," Will stammered in humiliation. "I can't read. He just slammed his hand on the table and told me to draw a cross in the blank space." A chill ran down her spine. Sarah realized Victor Shaw wasn't just using debt to coerce people. He was weaponizing illiteracy to strangle an entire community. The anger in Bram's eyes vanished, replaced by a suffocating dread. He looked at Will, but sadly saw the helpless reflection of his own father from years past. A man defeated by words before he even understood what he had lost. But just when they thought the situation couldn't get any worse, Will Moss looked up with bloodshot eyes and uttered a confession that shattered Bram's last glimmer of hope. "It's not just me, Bram. Victor has already prepared the papers, and he's gotten your signatures too." Past midnight, the cobblestone fireplace was reduced to glowing embers, its last vestiges of warmth drifting through the suffocating silence of Coal Bend Ranch. In the dark corner, Sarah was awake. She sat quietly at the rough wooden table, carefully smoothing out the dispute notice and placing it next to the seemingly insignificant package she'd just bought from Victor's shop. Under the flickering light of the storm lamp, through the lens of a tiny magnifying glass, the intricately concealed, sinister details gradually became apparent to the eye of a seasoned typesetter. It wasn't just the crude indentation of cheap ink or the unusual uneven spacing between lines. The crucial evidence lay in the chipped bottom corner of the R in Coal Bin Ranch and the horizontal crack across the belly of the B in the name Bram. A perfect, chilling coincidence. The notice, which hung over the very life of this farm, absolutely could not have been printed at the county newspaper office, as Victor claimed to legitimize the law. It had been stamped from the very same rusty, illegal printing press that lay dormant in the darkroom behind his counter. Sarah took a deep breath. This moment had forever shifted the course of the battle. This was no longer a simple land dispute. This was an organized, ruthless, and insidious legal fraud. Victor had deliberately printed the notice himself, secretly nailing it to the door to create false evidence, intending to silence Bram's appeal deadline, and thus brazenly seize the land without firing a single shot. She looked up, staring directly at the man sitting motionless in the shadows. Bram, he forged government documents. If we uncover this, he'll lose everything. Bram stared at the paper, then gazed into the fiery, fearless eyes of the small woman before him. The rough pride of a Western man gradually gave way to acknowledgement, an absolute belief in her intelligence. His jaw tightened, his deep voice rumbling like thunder, foretelling a fierce storm. If you're right, Victor doesn't just want to steal this land. He wants to swallow the whole road. The next morning, before dawn had even dispelled the cold mist, Bram, neatly dressed, saddled his horse and decided to make the 2-day journey to the regional land office himself. He loudly demanded that Sarah stay at the farm, locking all the doors for safety, determined to keep her out of this dirty legal battle. But Sarah immediately stepped out onto the porch, blocking the way of the snorting horse.
The proof is in the printed letters, Bram. You can't explain the misalignment of a typewriter better than I can.
Victor has eyes and ears everywhere,
Bram snarled, anxiety choking the rough man's throat.
My father lost everything because of these damned papers. I swore I would never let my woman face such humiliation in court. Indignation flared in Sarah's eyes. It was the first time they had truly argued, exposing their deepest wounds. So what do you think I traveled half a mile across the country to get here? Sarah stared directly into the enraged man's eyes, without blinking. Do you think I came to Hollow Bend just to sit idly on that porch chair, silently waiting for a man to return in defeat? Danger doesn't make you an outsider, Bram. A long silence stretched between them, tense as a taut string about to snap. Bram looked at the small woman with the unwavering gaze of a warrior. Slowly, he loosened the reins. Instead of uttering empty apologies or lengthy promises, Bram silently entered the house, placing the chest containing his entire legal life on the wooden table before her. He laid out old tax receipts, boundary demarcation papers, timber purchase logs, and a list of every day he had shed blood and sweat on this land. In the West, love isn't proven with words. Bram chose to entrust his life to her through action, and Sarah responded by sitting down and joining the fight. A moment later, the typesetter's finger paused on a faded invoice. She looked up at Bram, a cold, sharp smile playing on her lips. Look, Bram, Victor fabricated a debt for you on the very day you and Will Moss were 30 miles away herding cattle.
The preliminary hearing at the district land office took place in a cramped room, reeking of cheap cigar smoke and the stifling atmosphere of bureaucracy. Victor Shaw had laid out a perfect game. He appeared in a crisp suit, calmly placing Will Moss's fabricated statement, the signatures of 2 other indebted farmers, and, of course, the forged notice of dispute on the desk.
When Sarah boldly stepped forward, unrolled the paper, and attempted to point out the evidence of the chipped typewriter, her efforts were immediately met with a solid wall of prejudice. The clerk from the land office dismissively waved his hand, coldly dismissing her testimony. He had no intention of letting a new bride from the East come in and teach him how to do law in Dakota. Seeing Sarah sidelined, Victor Shaw smiled triumphantly. He leaned toward Bram, whispering a razor-sharp remark, deliberately mocking his late father's shameful, illiterate past. The ghost of the past struck a vital nerve, shattering the last vestiges of restraint in the Western man. Bram roared, lunging forward, grabbing Victor by the collar and slamming him against the wall in a frenzied rage before Sarah could grab his arm. But the damage was irreversible. The crash of the chair onto the wooden floor was an indictment. In the judge's eyes, Bram Cole appeared exactly as Victor had described him. A wild, violent, and utterly untrustworthy man. The deafening sound of the gavel shattered all hope. The trial was abruptly suspended, and the judge issued an ultimatum. Bram had only 3 days to produce living witnesses, or all his land ownership would be permanently revoked. On the silent, despairing journey back to the farm, the Wild West sky began to darken with a deathly, leaden hue. An early blizzard, carrying the freezing cold of the Great Plains, was approaching, roaring like a death sentence hanging over their heads. But as the wagon wheels rolled through the gates of Coal Bend Ranch, an even more cruel tragedy struck their eyes, pushing the situation to a point of no return. The barn door had been deliberately smashed open. All the hay they had stockpiled for the entire winter was scattered, soaked, and beginning to rot under the first icy snowflakes of the season. There was no time for despair. The November blizzard descended upon Hollow Bend Valley with a merciless fury, a punishment from nature. Bram grabbed his leather coat and plunged into the howling white night to save the panicked cattle fleeing through the collapsed north fence. Sarah didn't cry, nor did she tremble as she hid behind the door. She rushed outside, using burlap sacks to cover the remaining dry grass, then returned to the house and kindled a fire in the hearth. Soon after, the small woman, carrying a blazing lantern, tied one end of a rope to a porch post and stepped into the swirling snowstorm to guide Bram. Beneath the thick snow, an unfortunate calf had its leg trapped in a crevice in the icy ground. Amidst the howling wind, Bram cried out desperately, "Leave it behind, Sarah. Otherwise, we'll all freeze to death here." But Sarah's eyes inadvertently fell upon the image of the mother cow standing motionless not far away, stubbornly refusing to leave her calf despite the biting cold. She bit her lip until it bled, resolutely shook her head, then used her own hands to tie the rope tightly to the saddle and slid down into the slippery crevice. Bram paused for a moment, then immediately leaped after her. Their hands, scratched and bleeding from the cold, clasped together, using their last remaining strength to pull the calf up from the frozen ground. That night, in the wooden house that shook violently in the gusts of wind, Bram sat slumped by the fire, his broad shoulders drooping in utter exhaustion and helplessness. "Tomorrow morning you should catch the earliest train back to St. Paul, Sarah." His voice broke. "I've lost my land, my flock, and I'm about to lose my honor, too." Sarah didn't argue.
She quietly took the only woolen blanket in the house and carefully draped it over his trembling shoulders. Then she turned her back, pushed open the wooden door, and resolutely stepped out onto the porch, which was shrouded in a thick blanket of snow. Amidst the raging storm, Sarah used both hands to pull back the second chair that had been blown over by the wind, patiently brushed off the ice and snow clinging to its surface, and sat down firmly. She turned her head to look directly into the stunned eyes of the man inside the doorway, her voice piercing through the wind. "Listen carefully, Bram Cole. As long as this chair remains here, I will remain here." The storm passed, leaving the hollow-bend prairie in a chillingly silent, white expanse. But it was also thanks to that life-or-death night that the last defensive wall between the two of them completely crumbled. Bram no longer tried to push Sarah out of the fight to protect her. Between them were no longer two strangers bound by a newspaper advertisement. They had truly become teammates. The very next morning, before the snow had melted, they split up. Bram saddled his horse and rode alone across the frozen hillsides, searching for nearby farms. He didn't beg for pity. He looked directly into the eyes of his neighbors, whose livestock he had saved, whose blood and sweat he had shed digging wells and mending fences, and demanded that they tell him the truth. That unwavering resolve awakened Wilmos's conscience. After a sleepless night tormented by his ailing wife, the miserable farmer finally crushed his own fear, vowing to go to court and retract his false testimony. Meanwhile, Sarah drove into town. Not wanting to confront Victor Shaw directly, she quietly entered the county newspaper's dilapidated office. With her keen professional eye, she easily obtained a standard government notice. When held up to the sunlight, the truth was revealed. Its lettering was completely different from the death complaint hanging on her door. Not stopping there, Sarah returned and rummaged through the bottom of her trunk, finding a tattered old receipt that Victor himself had printed for Bram the previous spring. 3 pieces of paper placed side by side formed a fatal blow. The chipped R and B marks on the complaint perfectly matched Victor's invoice and were a complete mismatch from the county authorities' legitimate print. To shut down any further arguments, she wrote an urgent letter to her former printing press owner in St. Paul, requesting a professional certification document attesting to the faulty lead-type stamping. Every spear was sharpened, ready for the final battle. But just before the life-or-death hearing, a frantic knock echoed through the cold night. Will Moss stood under the eaves, trembling, and presented a weighty object capable of turning the world upside down. The draft of the forged declaration that Victor had carelessly thrown into the fireplace, but hadn't yet burned completely, its back still bearing the clear marks of counterfeit ink and reeking of the distinctive pipe tobacco from the villain's shop. The final life-or-death hearing took place in a cramped room of the land office, where the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, sweat, and pungent cigar smoke. Victor Shaw sat cross-legged, a smug smirk on his face. He was convinced that, in this harsh land, the impoverished peasants would always fear his ledger of debt more than the truth. But today, Bram Cole stepped onto the platform, not with furious fists or the cowering of a weakling. He calmly placed on the oak table the stained receipts for the timber he had bought, his daily logbook detailing his fence repairs, and the testimonies of his neighbors who had seen him sweat on that land. Bram spoke little, but each page he turned carried the immense weight of years of exhausting labor to survive in the Wild West.
Sensing the situation was in jeopardy, Victor immediately counterattacked, slamming the old fabricated dispute notice and the fabricated statement onto the table in an attempt to overpower her.
At that very moment, Sarah Lane stepped forward. Without asking the secretary's permission to speak on behalf of her husband, she spoke confidently, as if she had read the printed documents. She firmly placed the 3 papers side by side: a legitimate notice from the county newspaper, a purchase receipt printed by Victor himself, and the death complaint that had been pinned to her door. Her voice rang out decisively, sharp as a scalpel, dissecting each crime. Look closely. The same smudge of ink at the edge of the line, the same unusual misalignment of the letter R, and the same crack in the belly of the letter B. Just as Victor lunged forward, intending to denounce her as nothing more than a fabricated Eastern bride, Will Moss weaved through the crowd and stepped forward. The farmer threw the half-burnt draft, stained with counterfeit ink, onto the table, his voice choked with resentment. He wrote it all up and forced me to sign this filthy document, right when my wife was writhing in agony, needing medicine. The entire room fell silent. The government secretary's eyes narrowed as he scanned the irrefutable evidence. Victor Shaw's empire of deceitful words had officially collapsed. There was no bloody shootout. Bram Cole simply reached into his cloth bag, pulled out a broken oak chair leg, a relic of the storm and vile vandalism, and slammed it down on the table. "I'm not here to beg anyone for land." His voice was deep and resolute. "I'm only keeping the land on which I lived and shed blood."
The gavel struck. The complaint was dismissed outright. But as he walked past Bram to leave the room, Victor Shaw tilted his head slightly, hissing a chilling declaration of war through clenched teeth. "You can keep this land, but the road remains. Winter isn't over yet, Cole." Victor Shaw's threat before leaving the courtroom wasn't the empty roar of a defeated man. Although Bram and Sarah had won on paper, in this harsh Dakota environment, those who held the food and supplies could easily crush an entire community with fear. A second, more devastating and frigid blizzard was gathering on the horizon, demanding that small farms immediately herd their cattle across the Hollow Bend Trail to avoid freezing to death. Bram didn't hesitate. He, along with Will Moss and the bravest neighbors, grabbed shovels and hammers, braving the wind and snow to break up the ice blocks, repair broken gates, and guide the first herds of cattle down into the lower valley. Meanwhile, at Coal Bend Ranch, Sarah transformed her small living room into a hub of justice, where the light of truth replaced the shady corners of the general store. She unfolded her notebook, meticulously and clearly recording everything. Who had herded how many cattle across the valley? Who was running out of hay? Who was willing to share their last scraps of food? With neat strokes of ink, Sarah permanently deprived Victor Shaw of his most dangerous weapon. He could no longer use dubious debts to manipulate and sow fear. The farmers, who had once bowed their heads in resignation, now stood proudly with Bram, not through grand, empty speeches, but through the quiet actions of the West. Some brought sturdy ropes, others shared half a cartload of hay, and bare-shouldered men braved the wind, raising storm lamps to illuminate the most dangerous bend for the herds of cattle. The Hollow Bend Trail could not become the private property of a greedy merchant. It had returned to its true meaning as the lifeline of an unyielding community. As the last cattle safely crossed the windy gorge and darkness began to fall, Bram brushed the thick snow from his hat and turned his horse toward the log cabin, bathed in warm yellow light. There, through the swirling snow,
he saw Sarah standing on the porch, hammer in hand, meticulously repairing the broken leg of the second chair.
The Dakota winter hadn't yet released its grip on the land, but Coal Bend Ranch still stood firm amidst the white storm.
The land-grabbing complaint had been relegated to the past by law, the Hollow Bend Trail had been fully opened, and Victor Shaw's empire of fear had been forever buried by farmers who no longer bowed their heads.
In the golden twilight casting its light on the oak porch, Bram was busily replacing the broken leg of the second chair. But just as he was about to swing the hammer to hammer down the last nail, a soft yet firm hand gently grasped his. Sarah knelt beside him, calmly taking the hammer from the rugged man's hand, and softly said with a smile, "Let me." The hammer struck with a resounding, decisive blow, driving the nail deep into the wood, a firm affirmation of their existence on this harsh land. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering, and said that this chair was no longer merely a romantic invitation awaiting a wife. It had become a living testament that a true home cannot be held together by one person alone, but by two hands clasped tightly together when the storm comes. In the frontier, real men don't express their love with empty words or lengthy vows. Bram silently lifted his chair and placed it right next to hers, a little closer than before. They sat down together, their eyes fixed on the valley road, gradually sinking into the peaceful, cold night.
It was the first time Sarah Lane no longer saw this chair as a place she had been invited to, but as a position she had paid for with her intellect, sweat, and courage to completely belong to.
Bram Cole had been diligently building the second chair long before he knew her name.
But it wasn't until that devastating winter ended that he truly understood a fateful truth.
That chair was never made for a woman who would silently sit beside him. It was made specifically for the one woman who dared to stand up with him on the day the roof shook.
Thank you for stopping by and joining us through the storm at Hollow Bend. In the West, no one can face adversity alone. If you enjoy stories of love, survival, and courage on the frontier, please subscribe to the channel so our second chair always has a companion. See you on our next journeys.